Hello everyone, today we talk about the communal government of Cologne during the 11th, 13th century, mostly, observing a bit of local history in this sense and in the broader frame of what we have already seen about Germany in this specific phase. And we focus properly on the city government, right? And that was, as we will see, initially hegemonized by the archbishop of Cologne. It was notoriously, by this point, the most important prelate of the German kingdom, right? Importantly rising as the importance of the same city grew. You know that Cologne was the largest German city, one of the largest in Europe, right? Against, let's say, a German average was much lower, right? The most urbanized areas of Germany were, in fact, in the west along the Rhine, and in the south, in essentially what had been the Romanized areas. And the average German city was not particular; it was mostly a town, also, right? The idea properly there were different settlement, different demographic dynamics that couldn't really compare to mostly southwestern Europe. But Cologne, because of its position on the Rhine, together with other important centers, in fact, were connected in the same area to this also broader political institutional development of the German kingdom, had historically prospered. Right, Cologne had been erased by the Vikings at some point, but it revived quickly. It showed this great, in fact, entrepreneuriality, this opening to properly to the North Sea, to traffics with England, with even Scandinavia. At some point, we will talk about the Hanseatic League as well, but also the broader Rhineland traffics and the German resources exports. And therefore, the local bishops that in Germany had maintained, especially in Lotharingia, that Cologne technically had belonged to, as was still belonging, right, as this Teilreich, was traditionally an area of great episcopal power, right? There were many important prelates that rose to power controlling the cities, etc. That, in fact, in Germany, as you know, would, albeit, and this is the case of Cologne, as we all see, until 1288, albeit managing sometimes to gain the status of free cities of the empire and enjoying a quasi-complete autonomy, they wouldn't manage to oust the territorially out of the city surroundings the power of the bishop and of the prince. Is a bit, it was normal in Europe, right? The only place where this is not happening is Italy, but it's a very different situation. And so the princely power, whether lay or ecclesiastical alike in Germany, would maintain always the upper hand. And Cologne is, however, the case of major, aside from the Hanseatic cities that will be born also in a very different context, right? Because they were mostly decentralized from the centers properly of German monarchic power, right? And fundamentally existing in a very politically fragmented situation that favored its own autonomy, right, with essentially weak Scandinavian kingdoms and basically quasi absent in the north of Germany monarchic authority managed to prosper, right? Whereas these more important Roman centers, etc., that had their own urban tradition, a great deal of international relevance, etc., developed in a more properly as in the cradle of royal, let's say, sphere of reciprocal influence, right, of mutual cooperation to support each other, right? And Cologne, however, because of its prosperity, right, it's also economical properly, but also demographic strength, managed to develop under and eventually out of episcopal control a great deal of local governmental structures and autonomies proper freedoms at some point, as it would become the Freie Reichsstadt, and maintaining this privilege till very late in time. But in the second modern age, still the Archbishop of Cologne that had shifted to other residences, such as Bonn, right, always surrounding the city, right. This is the thing, would always interfere in the city heavily, also with complicated juridical instances. So the thing is interesting because you literally see these city-states as islands within actually a massive princely power, right, of that kind. The Archbishop of Cologne would maintain its, as you know, also during the 14th century, its institutional role of essentially the most important ecclesiastical elector of the empire. But for the 14th century, the Archbishop of Cologne was also appointed directly from the Pope. This is particularly important, whereas previously, up to, in fact, the Battle of Worringen, where the troops of the Archbishop of Cologne were defeated also by the infantry, local, infantry was developing at that point at the turn of the century. As you know, Germany properly wouldn't see properly an infantry victory unless we consider properly Switzerland as it was within it, and also the Dithmarsch in the north. But still there are signs of, even in there, surely the infantry development, and Worringen is especially one of the most famous. Well, this marked in fact that city freedom that the city would enjoy, right? But it was still framed within a much larger power, and it's fascinating to see that fundamentally the Rhineland would maintain these important level of political and institutional relevance, as still the other two major ecclesiastical principalities were Trier, right, is not on the Rhine, but pretty close, and Mainz as well, that we will have to discuss at some point specifically, because the social composition of the eminent classes of Mainz had the preeminence fundamentally of families of military and functionarial tradition, right, mostly essentially knights, right, as the ministeriales, etc. And this is very similar, in fact, to some Rhineland, but also non-Rhineland cities, such as Freiburg in Breisgau, Strasbourg, Worms, Osnabrück, that also fell in this case, in the latter case, for example, under the properly the Archbishopric of Cologne, Regensburg, Nuremberg. So we see this pattern, right? And if in the 12th, 13th centuries, ministeriales families accessed the aristocratic status, right, in some cities, where they properly make up the ruling class with this properly nobiliar character, preventing the rise of the middle classes, let's say of the bourgeoisie, of the trade of money, properly they had the means, etc. In some other realities, the ministeriales also find themselves committed in the mercantile and financial work that makes them in agreement with the bourgeoisie, and it ensures the fusion, fundamentally, the blending with the city patriciate. And this is the case of Cologne specifically, right? Because basically in other cities, what you have is that like it was on average the German situation. These local, we could say, not really petty nobility, because these were starting, especially by the 13th century, the ministeriales were starting to be really, the same level of free knights. We talk about the German ministeriales. These were essentially, they came to it, especially in the later phase of their success by the 13th century. By the 14th, basically the juridical difference had been surpassed, but for a couple of centuries, if not more, the ministeriales were fundamentally non-free knights. They were literally servants that were bought, purchased, deported, sent everywhere by their own lords. They were fanatically loyal, exactly because they were, properly tied to the to the will of the Lord and his success in this regard. Ministerialis is a term used in the Middle Ages, you probably know, as a sort of general administrator, right? In fact, even in Germany, where it was kind of a militarized countries in general, it was like a bit of it was more unstable, was more open to the east in a sense. So that there is this military bias that also proper local administration has, and that list of cities that we were recalling before actually shows this, right? But brought to these local administrators to become factually vassals, and that is lords on their own regard, right? So the advantage of this is that whereas the free vassal could, inherit because of the same imperial dispositions, right? Their fiefs and so on. Instead, the servant wouldn't. So this would ensure the lord greater control on the local realities, managing them in theory as they pleased, but which is not entirely true, because also the ministeriales at some point become so powerful that they say, they made a sort of class on their own. This is happening especially in southern Germany, right, between Swabia, Austria, these areas, but they were present elsewhere, and especially in the ecclesiastical principalities, right? So much that, in fact, they were the ones that also participated to, for example, the Raumfahrt. So most of, for example, the Hohenstaufen armies that fought in Italy were composed by these ministeriales of the ecclesiastical clienteles, and these German princes were very warlike, right? By lifestyle, they had a huge military retinues, and by European standards, whereas pretty much everywhere, by a certain degree, bishops took up arms in some cases, basically all the other Western countries, not as much as in Germany. That even in the ecclesiastical clergy reflects this military character. So, to make the long story short, in the presence of towns or cities that were developed quickly here we are in the low Middle Ages, so the moment of the major urban boom of medieval times. Well, and as we have seen, with a however a modest power compared to the surrounding princely rule, the ministerialis was properly used to rule over these cities, right? So, in preventing thus the middle classes from getting to the city, at least to the top of the city government, because still these, as we will see now also for Cologne, these guilds fundamentally existed everywhere. It was how normally medieval society was organized. It's just that they wouldn't, albeit striving, reach to the top, right? And partly because these lords were stronger, which is the average German situation. This is not the case of Cologne, because Cologne is so powerful, so big, so active, economically so populated, that the story goes in another way, albeit even in here there are strives, but it doesn't happen from a day to another. Actually, it's a secular process. And this, in fact, situation that we have tried to outline with the presence of ministeriales and cives, equated and undistinguishable, right, is already to be spotted in 12th century Cologne, right? So that the ministeriales and the cives, so specifically ministeriales and the citizens meant in a political sense of this city were, so as freemen, right, were basically undistinguishable because they were on the same level. What does this mean? It means that they were fundamentally doing the same things, right? As in the social ladder, they were on equal ground. They had, of course, there was a segmentation even in there, but there wasn't this class division because the middle classes were richer and could by themselves compete also with this other, but mostly also cooperate with this local ministeriales and the nobility in general. So indeed, Cologne is a city characterized by the precocious economical development and by the strong commercial physiognomy, right? That condition and mold properly the social and institutional structures of the city. already in the 11th century, the inhabitants that are fundamentally ordered in territorial communities that corresponded to a church, usually. In Cologne, there are many old and important, unique churches, including the oldest German church. These are all mostly also, some of them are founded in Roman times. The city surely maintains this very important, peculiar tradition in regard to. There are new foundations later on in centuries like the 9th, the 10th, the 11th, and on. In the 13th century, as you know, the famous Dome of Cologne is still one of the great medieval wonders in Europe. Starts to be built, right? So these are areas that concentrate an astonishing amount of wealth, right? So the inhabitants united by the 11th century under the guide of the Gilda, of the merchants, in a single urban collectivity, right? So basically this Gilda, made up of merchants, acts as one, right? And their governmental organ is constituted by the Scabini College, right? These are literally the makers, workers, of the Archbishop Tribunal, because still this college was being filled in this regard with ever more autonomous representatives, let's say more powerful representatives that, however, had been had been created by the Archbishop government. At this point, was still in charge of the city. Always remember that bishops in here were coming from a long tradition properly of public government. So this was happening as in basically any other city at that point of some importance, especially in continental Europe, with properly an episcopal government of the city. It was overlapping with the, let's say, it was paralleling the comital power sometimes, right? Sometimes properly in contrast with the same, because still there was a lay districtuation altogether, but at this point properly as, especially in case of the ecclesiastical signories, as properly realities on their own, because of all the immunities and exemptions that the church enjoyed in this regard. And within this same government, the Merchants Guild emerges as one, right? So with a consciousness of their own importance. So in the first decades of the 12th century, after harsh struggles, the Bishop of Cologne was forced to recognize the sworn association and the communio, so properly the communion of the citizenry, that by the mid-12th century is administrated according to a scabinate, let's say, regime that is brought under the influence of the Rijkerszekke, that is properly the rich man's society, in the hands of the great merchants and landowners that had, among its own proper competences, the granting of the citizenship right, the inspectorate on the commerce and on the handcraft activities. So basically, this new government is recognized also outside of the archbishop one by the same prelate, right? And these people can fundamentally control in the city, right, who can get the citizenship proper, right, and controlling fundamentally the trade traffic, which is fundamental because they can, from one side, basically let in just the people that are of their, that would fit to their political purposes, and also having a say properly on the most important sector there was trade on the Rhine. And at this point interfering properly on the also the same episcopal choices, right? So the XI-XIII is definitely the naturally also the proof of a stratification within the same merchant class, right? That exercises properly the influence on, as we've seen, what had been this branch of the episcopal government that had previously properly from which the citizenry had been represented in a political sense within the same, right? So there is properly the surpassing of certain prerogatives that had previously belonged to the bishop, right? And some as essentially a city autonomy. So between the 13th and the 14th century, when the struggle is exacerbated and it brings to the fundamentally to the Battle of Waringen, when the bishop is literally thrown out of the city, cannot set foot there, right? The regime of the city became a council, fundamentally, that governed the city, that was completely emancipated from episcopal power, right? And it would remain essentially hegemonized by the patriciate based on mercantile and landed property assets. So this is interesting because the 14th century, as you know, is also a moment of general lock of the institutions, late 13th, beginning of the 14th century, a bit all over Europe, right? So in this sense, the probably without the Battle of Waringen, things might have gone differently for Cologne, right? Probably we can't say whether radically so, but still it's meaningful to realize, as we were saying before, is that fundamentally that military event is the one that shifts definitely the balance for de facto complete autonomy of the city, albeit still within the archbishop's possessions. This is very important to stress, because many of you may say, well, but you're saying the city was completely autonomous, but still was within the archbishopric's power. So how did it work? Well, it worked in the sense that, as we've seen, this was a sort of communal government, right? It meant that in medieval times there was no, like, if something belonged, such as the city, right? The city here is meant differently whether we're talking about a government, right? That is in this case is properly this council, right? Or whether we're talking about the infrastructure broadly meant, right? This was shared because juridically speaking, there was never a complete cut between the two. This simply meant that the bishop maintained this broader influence on the city, whatever, because simply he had his archdioceses in there. But the problem is that he wouldn't have the grip on the council that had monopolized the control of the city from a factual economical point of view, right? And once again, this wouldn't put an end to attritions and things like that, as we've seen in the Second Modern Age. Especially the archbishop would come back on the offensive, right? Because these cities alone, that's the point. We're only about the properly what happened in the city, within the city walls. They didn't have in Germany the strength to go further and say, okay, let's start now eroding the archbishop's territorial assets. But no, right? They were just interested, after all, in the choking point. I mean, the point of passage on the Rhine, where this huge traffic passed from, that they controlled largely, and as a huge as a city, they had their own market that flowed from the surrounding regions, etc. And that was it, right? That's what they were content with, and not exactly that is to say, if they had more power, they would have probably expanded further beyond, right? But this was not the case, and it is still meaningful, and that's why properly there would remain an archbishopric, and not just a city-state with a territorial consistency. Right here, it's properly just local communal government presided by a council, where you see that the great merchants and landowners rule fundamentally, and things would go on like that. And especially from an institutional point of view, the form of the council was definitely the expression of the well matured political will to organize the merchants and the landowners to rule the city, right, and to subordinate to their own class interests specifically, right. And it was the accomplished, surpassing of the phase in which that organization posed itself as an instrument of properly emancipation from seigneurial power of all the citizenry, right. This is particularly important as well because still these oligarchs were in a way controlling the as through their clientele the whole city, right. So they could claim in a also ideological fashion of legitimization, etc., that they were properly speaking for the whole city as such, right. And objectively, yes, there were there were smaller guilds within the system, so other larger ones, so there were certain balances in that regard. But yes, they were represented, and they enjoyed this freedom that they would traditionally regard as such, so much that they would in fact obtain the title of free imperial city as such, right. And another very important aspect that we didn't stress enough is that makes actually the whole thing even more meaningful is that during the 13th century, as we've seen also in recent videos, such as the one about the rise of Otto of Brunswick and the struggle with Philip of Swabia, speaking in fact of the Archbishop of Cologne, Adolf von Altena, and also recently in the video we made on German violence during the reign of Frederick II, 1250. The archbishops of Cologne, that in the previous centuries had usually been, as we've seen, fundamentally the allies of the emperors, right, and especially of the Hohenstaufen, and also in the first moment, etc., because fundamentally imperial authority would preserve their own autonomies, their own power within their own territories, right. With the collapse of the Swabian rule, that the archbishops of Cologne had started to to profit from, also to properly contribute to at some point. Let's say the communities of the empire of Germany, in this case, were left fundamentally free to clash with one another. So the complications now, the various balance of power, etc., we don't cover. We'll leave for another video. But it's important to stress that the moment in which the city government of Cologne manages to emancipate from the archbishop's rule are also, incidentally, the ones of greater archbishop's power, right, as a landlord. And this is particularly important because it makes you understand that at the fading of Swabian rule, of imperial public authority in Germany, the archbishops of Cologne, from the top of their power, that had already been ambiguous relatively to the negotiation of who had to essentially be elected as emperor or not, was kind of normal for Germany, but it surely didn't contribute much to the welfare of the public cause, right, of a central government, well, had fundamentally enjoyed an enormous power. So the achievements of the city, specifically in this regard, and the set of alliances that they put together against the bishop, etc., to eventually earn their full autonomy, are even more remarkable, right? Because for the German average, what is a city that manages properly to counter such a powerful prince, right? This can be just for Cologne as properly as, not that it didn't happen in other times, but proportionally, like the archbishops of Cologne was enormously powerful. So also the city of Cologne was enormously resourceful, and this allowed for this balance, as we've seen, as ambiguous as it was in practice, but to exist, and for these classes to fundamentally enjoy this autonomy within the city walls. So it's important to remark. And this transformation of political functions of the city ruling class is also similar to the institutional and social events of the city of Lübeck. The city literally place because it was refounded by the Count of Holstein, 12th century, on the coastal stripe of the Baltic Sea, and destined to become the center, right, of the powerful Hanseatic League as its fundamentally as its founder, and an original city and most important city at the beginning. Then even in there the situation was a bit different, because as we will see for that city specifically, and as we were remembering also the beginning, there was a much greater autonomy these centers enjoyed, and they also let's say the Hanseatic cities acted as a guild altogether, right? They individually they weren't like they were well placed and enjoying this large autonomy as we have seen, but altogether, right? They made the critical mass, right? They could literally say to, I don't know, England, either if you don't make favorable trade conditions for all of us, for one of us, we will all bail out, right, of English market for that product. But and it was a very interesting way of operating, right? But also individually, they were never something like properly, a power that could, I don't know, for example, expanding the interland or having this kind of dramatic individual power internationally speaking. In fact, their power would fade at the end of the Middle Ages, when more say stronger German principalities would be developed in northern Germany, where also the Scandinavian monarchies strengthened in turn. So, and of the autonomies, they were pursuing. This is interesting because they were pursuing pure economical achievement. They also quarreled against each other continuously. They also made wars, right, against each other. Also, wars that were exploited by the surrounding powers that intervened in favor of this or that city, because we're mostly like four sections, four areas that, if you consider Lübeck, I don't know if it's fair saying Rostock, Hamburg, Bremen, they all had different areas of interest, etc. But at the end of the day, they were very permeable altogether. In fact, because of this, in part. So different stories, as you understand, but certain elements in common, and still, certain exceptions, which definitely Cologne is. Reality that, of course, the Hanseatic League is something peculiarly different. I don't know if you ever visited Hanseatic cities. I was lucky enough to visit lots of them. They left me honestly with a feeling that with the strongest feeling that I ever had of properly of love for freedom, right? And this sense of that it's something elevating as much as the air, as the freedom of the sea, etc. For them it was all one. There was a beautiful images, powerful mottos of things that reveal this, but still, in fact. There are cities like, I don't know, Hamburg is a city-state still, right? Still today within Germany as a federation, there are these effectively city-states, some which are properly are still considering independent, right? And this is as romantic, of course, as it is factually, but it does reflect that mindset. This also reflects very different realities in the same Germany that was really diverse within its own nature, indeed. And whereas Cologne, we see the giant, right, that manages even to oust the archbishop, the most powerful in Germany at that point. Whereas most of German cities, also of a certain consistency, as we've seen, would fundamentally see the rise of the middle classes curbed by the traditional military, functionarial, ministerialist class and seigneurial power through them, and that's also that makes you reflect. Naturally, we will talk about single German cities again, right? We're getting a bit more in detail gradually into these things. This was a very simple concept to essentially show how the city government of Cologne changed in these centuries, crucially, and essentially reflecting its economical prosperity and power. But there are many different realities that are also worth being, careful about, and we will see on another time. So for today we stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.